Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Advancing Consumer Engagements by Improving Customer Identity and Access Management. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are Steve Brazen, Research Director at Enterprise Management Associates, Martijn Loderes, Global CIAM Leader at Ibm Security, and Tony Lauro, Director of Technology and Security Strategy at Akamai Technologies. Steve's career at EMA follows 20-plus years of in-the-trenches experience in IT system support, engineering, and management for high technology, telecommunications, and financial institutions. Martijn is responsible for building and expanding the IBM CIAM practice. Prior to joining IBM, he worked at Janrain as their VP for Solution Engineering and Services. In 2014, he supported the startup of CSE Big Data Incubator practice, allowing extensive business intelligence expertise to merge and extend into the new capabilities of big data and AI. With over 20 years of information security operations experience, Tony has worked and consulted in many verticals. He is currently responsible for Akamai's North, Central, South American clients, as well as the training for an internal group whose focus is on web application security. And before I hand things over to today's speakers, I wanted today's audience to know that we will be concluding today's event by taking your questions. You can log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA later today that will include resources from today's event, so I hope you will check that out. Also, there will be an opportunity for you to get a free copy of Martijn's book on consumer IAM, Siam. Stick around until the end of the event to find out how to get your copy. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our first featured speaker, Steve Brazen. Steve?
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining us today for our discussion on advancing consumer engagements by improving customer identity and access management. Now, recent days have seen dramatic changes in the way consumers utilize digital services and markets, and I'm delighted to be able to explore some of those new requirements and optimal solutions in today's discussion. First, let's take a quick look at our agenda. I'll begin by laying the foundation of our discussion by talking about the different ways consumers interact with digital resources and how those engagements have been evolving, especially as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, we'll talk specifically about customer identity and access management, or CIAM for short. What it is, what are the key components, and how it fundamentally differs from other identity and access management practices. This will help set the stage for me to invite my co-presenters to the conversation for what I expect is going to be a very lively panel discussion on creating effective customer identity and access management engagements. Now, it should come as no surprise that no modern-day business can be successful without an online presence. In fact, the internet is now the principal method consumers employ to interact with businesses, whether it's to purchase items, access accounts, investigate products, or directly utilize purchased services. Collectively, we'll call these diverse interactions between businesses and their customers as digital consumer engagements. The last 2 decades have seen digital consumer engagements rise from being a mere novelty to a convenience, and finally to essentially a necessity for most people. Commercial, public, and professional businesses have all had to adapt to enabling a strong online presence, and the experience customers have with using these digital resources directly impacts their perceptions of the customer, of the company, its products and services, and the overall brand. IT directors and executives are increasingly being pressured to provide better consumer experiences in order to gain an edge over competition and ensure repeated customer engagement. Requirements for digital consumer engagement significantly intensified following the outbreak of COVID-19. Seemingly overnight, people broadly stopped shopping at brick-and-mortar stores and instead purchased both essential and convenience items from online retailers. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, retail sales from e-commerce in 2020 increased 44% over the previous year. We're actually seeing a whole new e-commerce market growing into existence. Now, for example, as recently as last year, the broad acceptance of, say, online grocery shopping was pretty much unthinkable. But today it's becoming rather common. A recent survey conducted by the retail research firm Inmar Intelligence found that roughly 80% of consumer respondents reported they had shopped for groceries online since the start of the pandemic earlier this year. Regional stay-at-home orders also forced many people to utilize online services that they had never before considered using. Now, for instance, there were many people who started to use online banking for the first time. And of course, with everybody trapped at home, we saw a huge increase in the consumption of digital entertainment, as well as the use of social media and online communications, most notably video calling and conferencing. I think it's important to recognize that these changes are not temporary. The world has really permanently been changed. We all certainly hope that medical science will soon find a way to halt the pandemic, but even if it disappears tomorrow, not everything will go back to the way it was in 2019. Most workers now have the resources to operate remotely from their offices, and many will continue to work from home as a preferred lifestyle. Even more impactful is the fact that many consumers have discovered the convenience of online services and shopping, and they will very likely continue using those resources, not because they have to, but because they want to. The increased focus on achieving success with digital consumer engagements are accelerating business IT requirements in two key areas: ensuring security and enhancing user experiences. Now, certainly, security today is broadly driven by regulatory compliance. Many regulations are industry-specific, such as HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act for healthcare organizations. Others will apply more broadly, such as the Payment Card Industry Security Standard, or PCI, which must be adopted by any organization that digitally collects debit and credit card information. The most disruptive regulations in recent years are the ones related to ensuring consumer privacy, such as GDPR, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulations, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and PIPEDA, the Canadian Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documentation Act. Now, basically, if your business wants to engage consumers in any of these regions, it is required to perform a number of very specific requirements, including obtaining consent on the use of cookies to collect information, providing transparency on the type of data being collected, and placing limitations on collected personal consumer information. Now, beyond compliance, proper security is also essential for protecting your business assets. According to our research, roughly 60% of all businesses experienced a security breach each year. And 90% of those affected have reported in our surveys serious consequences to their business as a result, including loss of revenue, loss of customers, fines, and remediation costs. You'll also want to be sure that the consumer accounts are not being misused to perform criminal activities, such as identity theft and fraud. And of course, if you offer a pay service, you want to be sure nobody is bypassing security to use those services for free. User experience enhancement goals are all about boosting business performance. Now, obviously, you want to entice new users and then encourage them to increase their use of your digital service. And you want to retain those consumers indefinitely, all of which is dependent on how satisfied they are with using their digital service in comparison with your other competitors. Now, for organizations that offer pay services or purchasable products, the impact of user experience directly affects sales conversion rates. Now, put simply, the happier your customers are with using your digital platform, the more likely they are to fork over a few bucks to continue that experience. Now, unfortunately, security and user experience requirements are often seen as diametrically opposed forces. That is, the more you increase security, the more you reduce user experiences, and vice versa. However, there's no reason that this has to be true, and it is possible to satisfy both simultaneously. In fact, in terms of of that when you simplify consumer security processes, you actually increase security by greatly improving the likelihood that the consumers will not try to bypass established controls. To dive into that concept just a little bit further, we can see this effect quite clearly by examining what we call the two faces of digital security. The first face is the one most businesses typically focus their attention on, the establishment of security policies and processes. And if everyone just followed these, there would rarely have ever be a problem. But consumers are people. And the reality is that people will almost always discover and use the easiest and quickest method for performing the task they want to perform, even if it means bypassing common sense security controls. Passwords are actually a great example of this. Now, traditional best practices for passwords require for the creation of unique passwords for every account, and the use of complex password strings and periodic password resets. But of course, no one actually follows these practices because who could possibly memorize hundreds of complex and constantly changing password strings? Another example is with the sharing of accounts. Rather than taking the time to create separate accounts, consumers often share credentials with family, friends, and coworkers, which could invalidate collected profile information if that is a key purpose of your digital surface. So by making the platforms easy and intuitive to use, organizations greatly increases the chances that consumers will actually follow security controls. Here are just a few interesting statistics I culled from the interwebs, exemplifying the importance of creating positive digital consumer experiences. And just to call out a few, 96% of unhappy customers never complain. Instead, most will simply leave and never come back. Another, it takes 12 positive experiences to make up for one unresolved negative experience. Also, a dissatisfied customer will tell between 9 and 15 people about their experiences. And 55% of customers would pay extra to guarantee a better service. And I think the celebrated football coach and former head of the National Football League, Vince Lombardi, put it best when he said, it takes months to find a customer and only seconds to lose one. And when it comes to digital consumer engagements, it may take only a fraction of a second for a customer to decide it's not worth his time and leave. Nor are user experiences more affected in digital consumer engagements than with the approaches adopted for consumer identity and access management. CIAM governs all the processes used to authenticate users and define the access they will have to offer digital services. This is where consumers typically gain their first real impressions of your company, your product, and your brand. And those impressions will be continuously reinforced during every subsequent interaction. Now, CIAM is often confused with more traditional enterprise identity and access management solutions. And I often see CIAM referred to as a subset of IAM. But I completely disagree with this perspective. If CIAM was truly a subset of IAM, then all requirements for CIAM should be part of enterprise IAM. But that's just not the case, not even close. The two each require distinct sets of capabilities. And I think it's important to take some time to call those out. Enterprise identity and access management is administered entirely by the business. The company gets to decide what resources may be used by which employees and under which conditions. Now, by contrast, CIAM is principally managed by the consumers. Consumers create their own accounts, set their own credentials, and determine which offered services they will use. Enterprise IAM prioritizes security. It exists to protect business assets, and employees are required to use whatever security controls are offered, whether they like it or not. Of course, enabling a productive workforce is also increasingly becoming important to businesses, but it takes a backseat to achieving requirements for security and compliance. Now, with CIAM, on the other hand, priorities are on user experiences. While security is important, media accounts, it's actually more critical to keep consumers satisfied and engaged. A great example of this can be seen with the increasing use of social media accounts as an authenticator in CIAM deployments. Businesses would never consider using social media accounts with employees because it's inherently low security. However, consumers are favorable to leveraging their social media accounts because they're easy to use and greatly reduce the amount of effort they have to do to access their other accounts. Enterprise IAM supports a fixed set of users. Now, these would be employees, contractors, and service providers. But the sky's the limit for CIAM. The very idea is to grab as many customers as possible, so the supporting platforms has to be highly scalable. The majority of enterprise IAM deployments leverage directory services such as Active Directory. Now, whereas because of the scalability requirements and the fact that they are storing consumer information, most CIAM solutions operate independently of Active Directory. Also, the primary goal of identity and enterprise identity and access management is the businesses to establish trust with the users before allowing them to access company resources. In fact, that's where the core concept of zero trust management originates. It doesn't matter if workers trust their employers' hosted services. They have to. I mean, it's what they're getting paid to do. With CIAM, however, it's a two-way street. The business must establish trust with the customers, and the customers must establish trust with the business. If consumers do not trust the business's level of security effectiveness and privacy controls, they will leave. Enterprise IAM solutions have to be very granular about how they define user access. One employee may be granted access to one set of resources, and another is granted access to a completely different set of resources. Supporting this access complexity requires a diverse range of policy definitions. Now, by comparison, CIAM is a much more basic set of requirements that is applied to all consumers equally. In support of those more complex access requirements, enterprise IAM solutions often include governance capabilities that monitor employee access events and their use of IT resources in order to audit security effectiveness and tweak individual access rights. CIAM, on the other hand, includes additional tools specifically for collecting consumer information and managing their engagements with the business. So you can see the two are very, very different practices. To provide an even better clarity about the unique requirements for consumer identity and access management, I've listed here 7 key elements to look for in any CIAM solution, and I'll quickly review each individually. The first is self-regulation. Self-regulation is registration. Self-registration is a key component of CIAM as it steps consumers through the creation of their user accounts and access credentials. Best practices for registration processes are to keep it as simple as possible. For example, only ask them to provide information you absolutely need to know, like their name, email address, password, and really that's it. You can ask them more detailed questions later when they have become accustomed to the service. Many customers will simply give up and leave at the registration stage if they are presented with a long list of and a complicated questionnaire. So try to keep these as simple as possible. Privacy consent is increasingly important due to GDPR and CCPA and other consumer privacy regulations. These are those pop-ups now that you're often seeing on websites informing you that they are using cookies to collect information on you. Privacy consent may also include long-form legal documents that unfortunately very few people actually read, stating what types of information is being collected and how it is being used. Since access to digital services is typically contingent on the consumer's acknowledgement and approval, privacy consent is an integral component of CIAM solutions. Managing authentication processes is a fairly obvious requirement for CIAM, but remember that related practices must emphasize user experiences over stringent security. You'll often hear the word friction as a term referring to the number of steps a user needs to perform in order to complete a task. So low-friction authentication processes are ones that only require one or a few very easily performed steps. Traditional passwords are generally considered a very high-friction authenticator. because they require the memorization, recollection, and inputting of complex and unique strings, as well as periodic resets. Passwordless authentication are typically low-friction approaches, including the use of hardware and software keys, behavioral analysis, mobile device authentication, and biometrics, such as thumbprint readers and facial recognitions. I strongly recommend enabling the use of passwordless authentication technologies by adopting solutions that support the use of the FIDO2 standard to allow customers to select from a variety of different types of preferred passwordless authentication methods. Another approach that has been gaining popularity in the CIAM market is the use of social media accounts. I mentioned that earlier as an authentication method. Now, basically, consumers are pre-authenticated using their Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Twitter, or other external account. And that authorization is passed through to the digital service being provided. So no additional authentications are necessary. Of course, this approach does require a certain amount of confidence in the security of the social media platforms, so this is not recommended for services that require elevated security, such as for financial accounts and payment systems. If passwords absolutely must be used, the goal should be to minimize the amount of effort necessary for consumers to manage those passwords. Now, for instance, the use of single sign-on capabilities will substantially reduce the number of times a password needs to be entered. Now, this is especially helpful if the digital service requires access to application subsystems or partner solutions, as the SSO will not require the users to re-authenticate in order to gain access to these systems. Another approach is to use something called step-up multi-factor authentication. With this solution, the CIAM platform identifies the contextual conditions of the access. For example, information would be collected on the trustworthiness of the user, the type of device they are using, the network conditions, and the sensitivity of the services that are being accessed. An intelligence engine, such as an analytics or language processing solution, is then used to determine the level of risk with enabling access. In low-risk scenarios, low-friction passwordless authentications may be used, and customers may be permitted to retain access for longer periods of time without re-authentication. High-risk situations will require more frequent and higher-friction authentications. The goal here is to match the amount of imposed security based on the amount of risk the business is willing to accept at any given time. Credential resets are often very high friction. The typical two-factor authentication process for re-authentication usually involves sending an alphanumeric PIN to a consumer's phone or email address that they need to enter before resetting passwords. Now, this process can be time-consuming and frustrating for users if they have to find their phone or log into their mail account. Offering consumers multiple methods for credential recovery will allow them to determine the process most convenient for them at that particular moment. Now, for instance, consumers could alternatively answer a series of personal questions or employ multiple passwordless authentication methods or be presented with a behavioral identity test. Additionally, you'll find you'll want to minimize the number of times consumers are forced to perform credential resets. In fact, the most recent edition of the Digital Identities Guideline, published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, recommends never performing periodic credential resets at all, but instead only forcing users to reset their credentials if those credentials have been detected as having been compromised. Elasticity is also important with CIAM solutions. Now, we saw this very clearly in the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak, when every online business saw a sudden and dramatic spike in consumer activity following the issuance of regional stay-at-home orders. However, it's important to recognize that rapid scalability is only one element to elasticity. You also want the solution to be able to contract back after demand diminishes to reduce operational costs. For example, you could expect demand to increase during a promotional campaign or during prime seasonal markets like the Christmas market, but demand can be expected to return to lower levels once these time periods are over. Cloud-hosted solutions offer eminent scalability, making them optimal hosting environments for CIAM solutions. Integration is also important to CIAM solutions. Since the platform will be collecting customer information, these details will ideally be stored in a centralized repository, such as a customer relationship management database, CRM. You may also want to integrate the platform with service or security management tools. Additionally, it's important to be sure that CIAM solutions operate seamlessly across all digital service components, including application subsystems and partner tools. Progressive profiling is a bit peripheral to CIAM, but also often incorporated into many of the solutions to take advantage of the collected consumer information. Again, it's critical that customers are not coerced to provide all information during registration, but instead requests should be spread out over multiple customer interactions, so it's not too painful for them. Progressive profiling may also collect data on consumers' frequency of access to certain offered services and on buying preferences. Now comes the part in the presentation that I've been looking forward to, because I get to learn something too. The panel discussion with my co-presenters today, Tony and Martijn. Before I invite them to join, let me just switch on my camera here, which, fair warning, if you have any small children or anybody with a heart condition in the room. Okay, there I am. My first guest for today's panel is Tony Lauro, who is the Director of Technology and Security Strategy at Akamai Technology. Akamai is a global provider of cybersecurity and content delivery solutions and is a leading provider of customer identity and access management solutions with its SaaS-based identity cloud platform. Tony, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Could you please tell us a little bit about Akamai and its support for the CIAM with the Identity Cloud Platform?
Absolutely. Well, Akamai was founded in 1998, one of the few survivors of the early .com organizations that came from that time period. And, primarily over the years, we've been doing content delivery, cloud security, and, web performance offerings. And over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been integrating the world's leading solution for CIAM, which is formerly known as JNRain, which is now part of Akamai's Identity Cloud practice. And this is really, cloud-native SaaS identity platform that's built to streamline and simplify the process of meeting compliance and regulatory standards, consent management, authentication and integration of SSO, and feeding all that into your MarTech stack so you can, manage those customer experiences.
Well, I have to say you're certainly covering the right topic at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I imagine you've seen a lot of growth over this year.
We have. In fact, we see about a third of the world's web traffic every day.
Wow.
So, it varies depending on, who our customers are at the time and the users that are accessing those customers, which gives us a lot of rich insight to be able to add value to both the security models that we provide as well as the identity platform.
Makes perfect sense. Excellent. My next guest joins us from the security division of IBM. Martijn Ladoris is the global CIAM leader at IBM Security and was responsible for developing IBM's CIAM services and support practices. Martijn, it's an honor to have you here today.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Could you share with us some of the ways that IBM services are helping clients today with enabling CIAM?
Absolutely. So IBM Security Services basically is taking on the role as a system integrator for our clients because, as you already alluded to, CIAM actually supports a numerous amount of use cases, right? It's not only access management, but we have to support workflow, IoT type use cases, et cetera. So we're really ideally positioned to help our clients from consulting, the deployment, and activities like migration and configuration, and making sure that even we address the friction that you mentioned with regards to how you design the user experience, where are you providing security fundamentals, but also where can you relieve some of the security friction elements that might come into play.
Yeah, I really like the reduce the security friction part. Obviously I'm a big proponent of improving end user experiences. So well done on that. Martin, actually, you're the perfect person to ask my next question to, because in your past life you actually worked at Janrain, which was the platform adopted by Akamai for their CIAM solution. And I know that Akamai and IBM have been partners for quite some time. But I wonder if you could elaborate on that relationship a little bit and tell us about how the two of you are working together to support businesses with CIAM today.
Absolutely. So the way we're working together with Akamai is elaborative on the system integration positioning that I just did. Actually, Akamai and IBM have had their relationship for almost 20 years now, supporting the deployment and integration of the Akamai technology across the client's landscape. And what we've been able to do as of last year with the acquisition of the Janrain platform is basically take the platform and the great functionality it provides, but then wrap around that the service components that are needed to guide our clients to successfully use it in the use cases that they're going after. So the way we're working together is that we collaboratively do solution design. We help the client establish a roadmap for deployment and then successfully help them to deploy that and then bring that to execution.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Tony, let me bring you in on the conversation a little bit. In the organizations that you've worked with, who are typically the stakeholders? I mean, who is responsible for defining and managing the CIAM processes?
Well, that's a good question. I think there tends to be a bit of a balance, whereas the traditional CIAM owners would be the customer-facing, consumer-facing, maybe even marketing teams, trying to figure out how to manage the relationships with their users and figure out what interesting information they can gather from those consents that are given over time to provide a better user experience for their customers. But there is also an interesting kind of security element, right? Because as you start to look at maybe the outsourcing or cloud hosting of an identity store, there's definitely a security element that plays into the mix. So we see, the security owners coming into the conversation earlier and more often, just to help kind of manage and really, again, provide a balance. Like, listen, there needs to be security as part of this process, but we don't want to provide so much friction that it ruins the user experience. And that's a very fine line that organizations are trying to straddle at this point.
Yeah, I imagine regulatory compliance is a big component of that as well.
Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, and if I can just add some additional color to this, Tony. So if you're thinking about who owns the customer, right? So there is no one owner across the different stakeholders. So you'll have to do with marketing, you'll have to do with legal, you have to do with the CISO organization, and even the CIO's organization with regards to how the data is stored. And I think one of the challenges that the CIAM solution brings is having to rally those different stakeholders together on a common set of requirements. And to your point, Steve, that means that also from a legal perspective, you want to make sure that you're capturing consent and terms and conditions in a way that you can utilize that identity across the different use cases or lines of business of your client.
Yeah, I would say that is also, a key differentiator with enterprise IAM. In enterprise IAM, I can tell you that the vast majority of stakeholders are IT directors and managers. They're the ones who decide what solution will come into house and support it. But of course, you're crossing many different department areas with CIAM. Do you find how is that usually done? Is that governance?
Were you asking, Steve?
I'll ask you, Martin. Sorry.
So what we traditionally see is that we have, let's call it a business owner. So either a service manager or offering manager or even a marketing manager that has a business objective, right? So if they're launching an IoT device or if they're launching a new service, basically they set the demand and the use case. And we see other parts of the organization then rally to support that. So you'll have your identity team supporting the motion of that offering manager to be able to reach out and to work with consumers effectively. Right. And that means that we're coming together into a governance model that is basically on a project basis for the initial launch. But as soon as you have launched, you want to make sure that those stakeholders are continuously connected when you're launching new use cases and not end up in different point solutions.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So actually, that's a perfect segue to my next question, and I'm going to address this back to you as well, Martijn. What are the biggest obstacles to achieving regulatory compliance with CIAM? I know that's like the big challenge for organizations is achieving their regulatory compliance. It's the most frequently cited reason for adopting a CIAM solution. Are there specific issues that consistently crop up with working with clients that you've seen? And are there certain types of regulations that are more difficult to resolve than others?
Yeah, so the biggest obstacle would say that traditionally we look at a regulatory rule set and see how we as an organization need to respond, which means we provide guidance around process and people and execution on how then we can make sure that we are compliant. I think one of the elements you addressed early on is that CIAM engagements are directed and led by consumers themselves. So right. They do the self-registration, the self-management of their data. And if you as an organization can enable that, you can actually enable yourself to be compliant, which means if you just look at the data subject rights and the way it's articulated, for instance, in GDPR, gives you a great foundation to be able to create a user experience that allows the consumer to execute on their rights by themselves, right? And therefore, inherently, you create that compliance embedded as part of your experience. The second part is that don't make the actual identity capturing and authentication embedded with business requirements. So even though you're going after a use case, keep that single identity or that persona small and centralized in a way that other lines of business can use it as well, so that it's not stuck or fixed in the context of what it was launched with, so that you don't take with you terms and conditions or consent elements that are specific to that use case, but that you can actually do more with that. So that's part of, let's say, the guidance I would like to give here as well.
Can you give some examples of how you could do more with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, if you have, let's take a bank for an example, right? Bank have, for instance, checking accounts, they have insurance packages, they might have mortgage packages. So the way you're capturing an identity should be specific to the persona and not to the service that you're providing. Even though the way that you're engaging with that service, you want to make sure that, for instance, you're capturing tracking information or mobile phone information to guarantee a level of security and safety for financial transactions. You want to only do that in the conjunction and the space that the consumer interacts with you. So have that centralized persona and then have information that's allocated to the service as a bolt-on to that so that you can utilize that persona in multiple fashions.
Excellent. I love it. Tony, I'm gonna give you the next question. Perhaps the greatest challenge to deploying an effective CIAM solution is to customize the environment to meet specific business requirements. Now, could you provide an example of a unique CIAM deployment that you helped implement for a client and how you overcome those challenges of customization?
Yeah, I think, there's many different use cases. One that comes to mind is a large consumer electronics manufacturing customer based in Europe. And they had an interesting challenge because they had, dozens and dozens of different lines of business, right? So you have this multiple levels of child and parent relationships that had to be accounted for. So, the goal was to provide a similar way of, creating a similar user experience, tracking of consent management across all the different omni-channel experiences of the different brands that this manufacturer had. And we were able to do that. And it's definitely one of those things where, and this goes back to Martijn's point of, having a point solution for identity doesn't do much good if you can't pass information on to other parts of your business, right? And there's other maybe security requirements in terms of logging in or false registrations taking place, et cetera, where you definitely would want to be able to share information, for instance, between a bot management solution and a CIAM solution for user registration purposes, right? That way you don't get a whole ton of, bot-created user accounts. So that's one example. And I definitely think that having a platform that can adjust and be extensible, really creating a platform of different variable changes that you can make and manage is key, rather than just throwing in a CIAM, and checking the box and trying to make that work with everything else.
Yeah, you mentioned bot-created accounts, and I imagine this is becoming an increasing problem. We're seeing it in a lot of different fields, but certainly it would be related to CIAM. Are you seeing it as an increased challenge with your customers?
Yeah, I mean, not just from the point of, increased scalability and stability challenges that they might have, whereas, before, during the day, in working hours in whatever region you're in, people are at work. There's kind of minimal online shopping from those consumers. But now with the work from home model, really the gloves are off, right? We've been asking our customers to move into this kind of digital transformation new realm. And guess what? With the pandemic, we definitely have it. Everybody is online. Everybody's interacting digitally. And there's a ton more engagement from consumers via these digital channels than there normally would have been, prior to the pandemic.
Great.
And with that, I wanted to add to that for Tony is that the time to go to market is becoming critical as well, right? And a lot of companies want to go to market faster as part of that digital transformation. And some of the unique elements that also the Akamai platform brings to bear is something they call hosted login, and which is basically a hosted experience that as a developer, I only have to do a linked redirect and not embed a lot of code that requires testing into my environment, right? So those would be areas where jointly with the Akamai and IBM relationship, we can actually help our clients not only do this securely, but also speed up their time to market.
Right. I want to go back to this discussion you both brought up about the unfortunate use of point solutions that I see. I've seen many individual organizations adopt to address very specific CIAM challenges to sort of layer on top of each other. In my opinion, over time, this kind of creates more problems than solutions. I'm going to address this one directly to you, Martijn, see if you can chime in on this. Would you agree with that it's more challenging than worth the effort? And how do you advise customers to get around this?
So that's a great question with regards to point solutions. I think that what's happened in the marketplace is that as a business owner, you want to go to market fast with the idea that you have, right? Because it generates the revenue for the client and for the company. And that means that you work creatively to be able to catch what I call the digital eye. You want to stand out in the crowd, right? So bank A versus bank B, what's the experience look like, and how can you entice consumers to be able to sign up with your services? So traditionally what happened was, as the business owners have their own budget, they worked with creative companies to be able to create something to go to market with that fit that need. And what's happening right now with the CIAM motion and also the education that's happening within the identity teams, how to support businesses better, is that we're moving towards a more repeatable program usage of the technology. As you mentioned earlier, from a technology perspective, IAM and CIAM are very close. It has to do with mindset and setting requirements. So I've seen more and more organizations rallying behind that CIAM motion to be able to support their business better and therefore move away from the different point solutions that might exist. The challenges with the point solutions is that you need to then collect data from multiple sources to really understand consumer behavior, family dynamics, and also how to even provide personalized messaging or tailored offerings. and because you want to understand all these different touch points. When you successfully deploy a CIAM platform like the Akamai Identity Cloud, you have all those identities with a single ID in one place. Therefore, you can easily stitch together that consumer journey and understanding which touch points they've had to make sure that you can provide personalized engagements, next best actions, and also therefore drive better conversion as part of the customer journey.
I imagine it's also helpful to have a unified solution because you can have a centralized repository for collected consumer information, right? So if you have multiple CIAM platforms or multiple interfaces for accessing it, they're all going to be collecting data separately, which might actually end up being contradictory. And you want a single voice of truth when it comes to collecting information about consumers. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. But also, and this is also a little shout out to Tony, with regards to the security aspect of it, right? If you have multiple usernames and passwords across different touch points of your landscape, it's far harder to be able to guarantee that security or to understand a breach or a spoof and to be able to respond accordingly.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, moving on. Tony, the next one's for you. Earlier, I discussed the impacts of COVID-19 on digital engagement. Now, what recommendations can you offer on how businesses should adopt CIAM processes to support what's now being called the new normal?
Yeah, the new normal is an interesting term because, as things start to maybe go back to the old normal or maybe not, the question is, how do you have a platform that is able to adapt to the next normal, right? Whatever the next normal, the next stage of living is an interesting question, right? I think one of the first things again is that when you look at digital engagement and how it's massively increased over the past 6 or 8 months, one thing comes to mind. Martin mentioned the eye of the consumer, right? So if you have a big, large event, just say, maybe say a Super Bowl or Cricket Championship League or World Cup, something like that, you're basically getting the eyeballs of the public in one spot, and then you're directing them somewhere. So I mentioned before about extensibility and resiliency. You'd be surprised at the amount of organizations that come to us and they say, listen, we had this huge marketing push. We spent, a couple $1 million for 30 seconds of advertising, and we had this great promotion going on. And as everyone came in to try to register for the new car that's going to be limited release or the new, consumer electronics device that is super popular, as people came in and tried to interact with our platform, the platform failed. It could not handle the influx of all these requests at the same time.
Wow.
Not to mention, if an attacker says, you know what, I don't like the way that the CEO talked about illegal whaling off the coast of Japan, so I'm going to attack them at the same time, right? Attackers love to cause friction at the time where it matters most to your business. So when you think of the idea of we haven't been attacked in a year, I'm going to stop focusing on this as a threat. Attackers love to target and time their attacks in the moments where you need it the most, right? Where you would need it the most. So definitely looking at, again, hosted login as one kind of a concept where you're basically outsourcing the front end engagement with the consumer. And then as the identity is created and things are solidified with that, that's passed back down the stack, back into the business. But you're shielding yourself from that front end and the risk of adversaries trying to do harm or even a flash crowd of good users causing harm to the platform that you might have. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If I can add some additional comments to that, Tony. So what you're describing is unique to CIAM because within an IAM environment, we're within the trust of our enterprise. Everybody that we're engaging with went through a background check by HR because they were hired as a contractor.
Correct.
Or there's a process, right? And within the CIAM environments, we are in the open space. So per definition, we need to have security by design to make sure that every engagement is a trusted engagement in a way that we can interact with them. But also, to your point, we need to be able to, therefore, in this open space, accommodate the auto-scaling and the availability that goes along with the interactions for a business. Because if you're down on that Black Friday when you are the hottest thing that people want to buy, you're losing serious amounts of revenue. And I think this is where a good CIAM platform can really support you in providing not only the security elements, but also the scalability and availability required to be successful as a client.
I think and that really calls back to the need for a flexible CIAM platform, as well as the ability to customize the environment to meet the requirements. I mean, there really is no one size fits all when it comes to CIAM.
No, I mean, all the use cases, right, are all over the place. I mean, right. you will have a simple sign up for a newsletter. You have maybe the authentication for a streaming service like a Super Bowl, like what Tony was referring to. It might be a workflow to get an insurance quote. So we need to support, as a platform, we need to support our clients in a way that they can capture identity seamlessly by not forcing all the identity capture in one place, but for instance, doing this progressively, as you mentioned. But at the same time, establish a relationship that is not only a one way from the company towards the consumer, but also we need to establish the trust relationship from the consumer with us, right? Because you want them to engage with us. And I think that's pretty unique in the way that that CIAM addresses the market and supports our clients' businesses.
Excellent. So I'm just going to ask one more question before we open the lines up for Q&A. And Martijn, I'll let you finish this one, finish off our discussion. At what stage in the development of a digital resource should organizations consider introducing CIAM? I mean, is this something that businesses need to think about while they're developing a platform, or is it something that they could add later?
That's a great question. So as soon as you are engaging with consumers that has the ability to capture an identity, right? So you're engaging with them. You need to start thinking about how can I do this in a repeatable fashion, which means that how can I just capture Steve's first name and Steve's email address to be able to know that Steve entered the door, right? So for instance, it's kind of like knowing who's on the other side, because as soon as you know that, you can start establishing that relationship and you can then build them into a customer. So that basically means actually at the inception of the personas, your journey mapping, and all those things, you need to take this into consideration. And our teams are perfectly suited to be able to help you with that, to be able to set those personas, problem statements, even do the UI UX design in the wireframes, to be able to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the experience, and then we translate that into technology requirements for the platform on how we configure that and how we launch that for you.
Well, let me flip that around a little bit, because suppose an organization is already invested in developing the platform, and didn't think about CIAM. Can you help them with that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And basically what we have as business outcomes, because one of the things that you need to articulate very well in those type of environments is that they already have a registration experience and an authentication experience. So what is their value for adopting into a single platform across the different lines of business, right? So articulating their increased time to market, articulating the higher conversion rates or the higher click-throughs or the better positioning of personalized messaging and advertisements. All of those areas that are really business impactful are part of the messaging that we bring to our clients, why they need to change towards a single platform. And then we can then support the how with regards to how we do that transformation seamlessly. So we also don't disrupt the consumer experience that exists today, because we don't want to force consumers to force a new password request, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Very good. Great answers. Well, that ends my questions, but I want to turn it back over to Raleigh to drive us through the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Steve, Martijn, and Tony, for that insightful conversation. Before I jump into the Q&A, I did mention at the start of the event that there would be an opportunity to get a free copy of Martijn's book, Consumer IAM, CIAM. You can request your copy by answering this question. It is, what is the biggest challenge your organization faces with supporting CIAM? You can put your response in the chat or Q&A window. I will be monitoring your responses. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. Steve, I'll start with you. Tony and Martijn, if you have any questions or any feedback, you can feel free to jump in. Steve, the first question is there a difference between consumer IAM and customer IAM?
Yeah, that comes up a lot, actually. The short answer is no. It's a term that's used interchangeably, whether you use consumer or customer. They both begin with C, so CIAM still works, right? I will add to that in my perspective, I prefer to call it consumer identity and access management rather than customer, because customer implies that money is changing hands. And that isn't always the case. In many CIAM engagements, it may be an ad-based environment, or it may be a free service that they're putting out there to collect consumer information. Not necessarily requiring payment before using the service. So from my perspective, I prefer to use consumer over customer, but the terms are used interchangeably all the time in this marketplace. They essentially mean the same thing in terms of the products on the market.
Yeah, and if I just can add to it, Steve, I prefer a consumer as well, because if we're talking about the customer, which customer is it, right? Is it our client that we're trying to help? Or is it the end consumer? And most of the times, as we're saying here, it's a self-service of a consumer. So hence, we're also the title of the book is focused on that consumer group.
Great, thank you for that information. The next question is, can you offer any insights into the future of CIAM?
Oh, goodness, yes. We could do an entire presentation, I think, the three of us, just on this discussion. I think two things leap to my mind on this. The first is that what we're seeing is that there's CIAM is sort of coalescing in the industry. We're certainly seeing this with what I called the use of social media accounts or external accounts for enabling access. This idea that you have one authentication method used for multiple interactions with different companies. So rather than having the same CIAM interaction with one company, it's a one-to-one relationship, you have a one-to-many. It's something I've been calling the consumerization of identity. We saw 10 years ago the introduction of the mobile devices into the marketplace created the consumerization of IT, which is consumers determine the direction of technology and the direction of personal computing rather than enterprises making that determination. Well, we're seeing the same thing in the identity management marketplaces, where consumers are deciding which types of authentications they prefer to use, and they're pushing the market in that direction. And the simpler the authentication, the more likely they're going to be willing to use it. Another area that I would call out along those lines is device authentication. Say the use of your mobile device is the one voice of truth. You authenticate onto your device. Everybody authenticates onto their mobile device, or hopefully you have some sort of security on your mobile device. And then once you're authenticated onto the device, and if that device is known to be trusted, you can then use that authentication to pass through to the service that you're trying to access. This could be used for a variety of services so that you're only authenticating with the device. Now, there's a number of ways to do this. I think the most common way of doing it is to use a software key on the device that gets downloaded, and then that can be used by the different services. Also, there are a number of consortiums that are popping up right now to create a unified authentication process that would be utilized by multiple services. So I think all this, you look over the next 3 to 5 years, it's all kind of coming together with unifying authentication so that you don't have to authenticate to every single service. You can go independently to each one.
Yeah, and last but not least, I wanted to add that the power of the consumer is increasing, meaning with the legislation of data subject rights and with the ability to choose, right, as there's more and more choices out there, I can choose bank A, bank B, insurance A, insurance B. Consumers will actually increase their power of choice. And therefore, companies have to do this digital transformation to entice consumers and provide more and more frictionless experiences where security is assumed and embedded as part of the flow.
Right, makes sense. So I think we're at the top of the hour, so Marta, I'm going to give you the last word on that. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Go ahead, Raleigh.
Yes, I was going to thank everyone too. Steve, you beat me to the punch. Thank you, panelists, for your insightful conversation today. And I wanted to thank the audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. As I mentioned, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA later today that will include resources from today's webinar. So be on the lookout for that. And I hope that we'll see you at a future EMA Research webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.